talk about government and private email accounts as well as company email accounts and the privacy issues that surround them. Good morning. Thanks for being here. Let's start with the letter here from Henry Waxman. He's the chairman of the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee. He sent a letter to the White House recently asking to find out why top White House officials had opened up non-government accounts to do political business. Are those email accounts, what laws do address those non-government email accounts?
Well, it's not clear if any laws address the non-government email accounts. I think Congressman Waxman's concern here is that there is a critical law, which is the Presidential Record Act, that requires White House officials to preserve their email correspondence, and it's part of the way of ensuring oversight and accountability of the decisions that the President has made. The concern that Congressman Waxman has here, of course, is that by creating these email accounts that operate outside of the White House email system, they're not being preserved, and they won't be available as they should to Congress at some point in the future, to researchers and to others.
Are these White House staffers breaking any laws by having non-government email accounts?
They could be. I think that's the inquiry that Congressman Waxman is initiating through this request to the White House. He's actually sent similar letters to the chairman of the Republican National Committee and also to the former chairman of the Bush-Cheney 04 campaign. And what I think he's trying to do at this point is to determine what the practices have been at the White House. Were they, for example, instructed to use non-White House email accounts for various correspondence that they might have had with the Department of Justice or with Mr. Abramoff or with others?
We want to get our viewers involved in this conversation. If you're a Republican, dial 202-737-0001, Democrats 202-737-0002, and all others 202-628-0205. I want to show our viewers as well just a standard disclaimer that is often put at the end of company emails, and it reads, "The information in this email is confidential and may be legally privileged. It is intended solely for the person to whom it is addressed. Access to this email by anyone else is unauthorized. If you are not the intended recipient of this email, any disclosure or copying or distribution of it, including forwarding, posting on a website, or using a blog, for example, is prohibited and may be unlawful." Why is this necessary?
Well, companies do this because, of course, they're concerned about the contents of employees' email. There may be confidential business communications, there may be trade secrets, there may be email that contains material that's embarrassing. And so companies routinely require their employees to include this disclaimer. Now, it doesn't mean that the email can't still be obtained. For example, if you get into litigation and there's discovery and the opposing order says, you know, the opposing party gets an order that says we get access to your email, that disclaimer is not going to protect you. But it is a standard practice now, particularly in the United States, to basically say within a company, the reason that this email is being sent is for company business.
What privacy laws protect the average citizen at work and their emails?
Well, we have important privacy laws in this country for electronic communications. Our Federal Wiretap Act, for example, was updated in the 1980s, and it specifically addressed this new way of communicating. Electronic communications. I'd worked on that, in fact, back in the 1980s, and there were companies like CompuServe and MCI Mail, and people thought this is great. They can send email, but they wanted privacy. And so the Electronic Communications Privacy Act established some protections for people who are using email services so that it would not be so easy for others to get access to their private messages.
Our first call from Mr. Rotenberg comes from Gaithersburg, Maryland, our line for Republicans. Good morning.
Hello, how are you this morning?
Doing well, thank you.
I'd like to know if people are using emails illegally or trying to influence a bill in Congress, is that a federal offense?
Well, it will depend very much on who the email communication is to and which branch of government one is communicating with. Generally speaking, for a citizen, for example, to send email to an elected representative or to a federal agency, there's no violation of law. In fact, that's exercising your First Amendment rights to petition your government. But with respect to the conduct of individuals within the government, they're going to be subject to different rules. Congress, for example, is not subject to the Freedom of Information Act. And for that reason, members of Congress staff that work on the Hill can send email without much concern that they will be subject to open records requests, whereas those who work for executive agencies or for the President they do have to be concerned that those emails can be subject to the disclosure laws.
Why don't Capitol Hill staffers fall under the same requirements as executive agencies?
It has to do with the determination that was made when the Freedom of Information Act was passed originally back in 1966. And the sense was that it was really the executive branch of government, which was very powerful because of the agencies that needed better accountability, better oversight. And so it was the agencies of the executive branch that became subject to the Freedom of Information Act. And that's the approach we've generally followed. Now, I will mention that's not necessarily the approach that's taken in other countries around the world. And so a lot of the recent open government laws that have been adopted in Europe, for example, treat the records of the parliament subject to open government obligations as they do the records of the executive.
Any movement on Capitol Hill to change the law?
Not yet. It comes up from time to time. I think generally speaking there is a sense that because of the amount of power in the executive branch of government and particularly the expenditure of funds, it has really, in the U.S. tradition, been directed toward that branch of government.
Rolla, Missouri, on our line for Democrats. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you this morning?
Doing well, sir. Thank you.
Very good, very good. I'm just curious, this gentleman that you're interviewing here, I'm going to ask you a question. What would he think the odds would have been if the Democrats did not win back in November of '06 or took back over both houses? Would any of this been uncovered?
I think that's a very important question because, of course, when you look at the amount of oversight in Washington, one of the questions that people often consider is, do you have the same party in Congress that you do have running the government? And I think it has been the view of many people over the last few years, both Democrats and Republicans, that with one party in power, there's not been the same type of oversight that you have today, for example. So a Democratic chairman of an oversight committee will ask the head of an agency named by a Republican president to produce records that help answer questions about the activities of that agency and compliance with law. And from my perspective, I think that's how it should be. I think we get better oversight and better accountability when there is that arrangement between the branches of government.
Our guest this morning is Mark Rotenberg, and he is the Executive Director of Electronic Privacy Information Center. He also teaches information privacy law at Georgetown University Law Center, and he's the author of this book, Private Information and Technology. Our next call for him comes from South Leon, Missouri, on our line for Independence. Good morning.
Lyon, Michigan. Happy Passover.
Oh, sorry about that. Go ahead.
I just wanted to mention that if there's a breakdown in the technology that surrounds computers and everything, I think George Bush is only going to have an airplane in his library. And I wondered what Mr. Rotenberg has to say about that.
Caller, I'm not quite sure if I understand the question. Obviously, there's a lot of concern in the federal government about the security of the government record systems. There's been recent disclosures that the IRS actually misplaced almost 500 laptops containing records of taxpayers, which has a lot of people concerned. And even in the discussion about the emails and the use of the non-White House email system, it was interesting that some people noted that the White House email system provides some levels of security that the other email systems that White House staff might have used, such as the RNC server, does not. So this person suggested that in addition to the political and legal risks, there might have also been some security risks in the decision of White House staff to use the non-White House mail system.
What impact has the use of emails had on how our government works?
Well, I think in many ways the email has accelerated the decision-making process. It's simply easier to move information around the federal government between key decision makers. It's easier to get more people in the loop because you have a big CC field and you add lots of names to try to let people know what decisions are being made. But at the same time, of course, it's leaving a more detailed record because communications in the past that might have taken place in person or with a telephone call are now being recorded and stored in the email systems.
Our next call from Mr. Rotenberg comes from Hoboken, New Jersey, on our line for Republicans. Good morning. Hoboken, are you there? I think we lost the call. Is there any effort by Congress to update some of these privacy laws that affect email and other technology devices?
Yes, there is. Part of it is because when the last updates were done in the 1980s, we had one type of technology in place, and of course the technologies evolved very rapidly. We have web-based mail servers today, we have IM systems, we have more and more types of email communication, and the courts over the last few years have been struggling with these issues. I think it's probably about time for Congress to update that law as well.
Will they do that this year?
I think it's possible. There are certainly issues regarding access to stored communications, what constitutes an intercept. That's a very interesting question Federal Appellate Court considered last year, and there is legislation pending in Congress to try to clarify some of those issues.
Back to your phone calls. Elmsford, New York, on our line for Republicans, is that right?
Hi, good morning. I just wanted a first statement and then question. Statement, I really don't think privacy exists so much in today's society. And I had the opportunity to speak with Bob Barr when he was advocating, ex-Congressman, I guess, Bob Barr, when he was talking about the Patriot Act and trying to get, I guess, rid of some of the nuances of it which are infringing upon privacy rights. And I made the comment that, thank you for your hard work, but we still have the IRS, which has our whole life on pieces of paper there. So my question is, why does the government actually need all this information in the first place? Thank you.
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I actually agree with you that I think in many areas the amount of data collection that's done by the government, particularly on individual citizens, should probably be reduced. And certainly when data is collected, I think the government has an enormous responsibility to protect the privacy and security of that information. One of our big concerns over the last few years is that the government has simply done a very poor job protecting the privacy of the personal information it collects. You may remember last year there was the story about the laptop that contained records on over 26 million American military personnel. That was misplaced by an analyst at the Department of Veterans Affairs, and I think the VA felt badly about that, but should have never happened. So the government really needs to do a much better job. When it makes requests for this, sensitive personal information, it really has to protect it.
PC World magazine addressed the issue of top White House staffers using non-government email accounts, and they write, the White House email case should be a wake-up call for businesses that face similar situations, said John Elber, a technology lawyer at Bryan Cave LLP in St. Louis. The problem, he said, is that all business communications must be securely archived in stored in the event of lawsuits, government inquiries, and other legal scenarios. When such records aren't tightly controlled, any large unsubstantiated gaps in the stored data can mean disaster in court, he said.
That's right. Well, I think businesses are facing many of the same issues that government agencies are, and businesses also have record-keeping obligations, and sometimes will have to disclose that information if there is, for example, litigation. But I think the key point here for the business is if there's not an actual discovery order, which is to say if you're not actually required to disclose the information, then of course you don't want it to get out. So as with the federal agencies, businesses are looking much more closely at their practices of archiving email, who has access to the email. There was just this past week an indictment in New York involving a Morgan Stanley technical expert who gained access to a client list. Obviously caused a lot of concern for that company.
Could businesses and the government legally prohibit their staffers and their employees from having non-government accounts?
I think it would be, on the government side, clearly a violation of the Presidential Records Act for the White House, for example, to instruct White House staff not to use government accounts. It would really...
No, to have non-government accounts.
To prohibit them, yes.
Right.
In fact, my understanding is that during the Clinton administration, this practice was really frowned upon. The understanding was that if you're working within the White House on behalf of the government, your communications had to run through the White House mail system so that they could be properly archived. I think it probably is the better practice.
Cambridge, Maryland, our line for Democrats. Good morning.
Hi. I just wanted to make a few comments. I appreciate what your role is. I think it's, first of all, it's important what you just mentioned, that a lot of people don't realize that the executive branch runs the government. The legislature makes laws and conducts oversight and provides funds for the executive branch to run the government. The other thing that I wanted to say is that as far as the elections go in '06, because it appears that the Republicans, when they run the government, which is something they hate, and by the way in which they run it, it shows. If our government were a company, it would be the kind of company that is run by its suppliers at the expense of the customers, the American people. And I believe that if we had not had the 2000 elections, the lack of oversight would have led us right into a dictatorship. And one of the concerns that I have when you talk about the emails in the White House is people like Karl Rove having access to classified information after we know that, for example, his connection to Abramoff and, that nobody's talking about. So I appreciate what you're doing, and any comments from you would be great. I'll take it offline. Thanks.
Thank you, caller.
Well, thank you. You make an important point, and I think it's also critical to understand that the open records laws that we have in this country, the Government and the Sunshine Laws, we have the Federal Advisory Committee Act in addition to the Presidential Records Act, are all intended to promote oversight and accountability of any government that's in power, Democrat or Republican. And of course, for those laws to work, there has to be meaningful oversight, there has to be enforcement. And I agree with you, certainly. I think a lot of people are frustrated about the amount of secrecy, the difficulty in getting access to the basis of some of these key decisions. But I don't think it's a view that's necessarily partisan. There were many similar debates that arose during the Clinton administration. I think that administration learned early on that it was better, generally speaking, to be forthcoming with the Congress to provide records when they were requested to committee chairmen. This administration has been more difficult in terms of the oversight process, and you see this in particular over the Senate Judiciary Committee, where the chairman of that committee, Senator Leahy, has repeatedly asked the Attorney General for materials, and the Attorney General has not been forthcoming. But again, I see these as important goals that should apply to any party that might be in control of the White House.
Mr. Waxman has asked for these emails from the non-government accounts. What laws can the White House cite for not giving up those emails?
Well, this is one of those classic tug of wars between Congress and the White House, where the White House basically has to make a decision whether it's going to cooperate with the Oversight Committee and allow the relevant facts to come out and for some assessment to be made, or whether it's going to basically put up a wall and not disclose. It's not a legal position, really, that the White House would be taking with regard to using email systems not within the White House. The White House has certain rights with respect to privileged information provided to the President, the circumstances under which that may be disclosed, but I don't see the legal basis for them to say that they had the right to engage in public business using non-public email services.
Would those emails from a Yahoo account or a Gmail account, would they fall under executive privilege as well?
I don't think they'll be able to assert executive privilege if they use the non-White House email accounts. I mean, it's a little bit of a circumstance where you almost admit at the outset that you weren't engaging in government business, you weren't advising the President by virtue of your decision not to use the email service that's constructed for the White House staff to advise the President. So to simultaneously say that they could take advantage of these non-White House accounts and assert a privilege as if they were a White House employee, I think that would be a difficult position to argue.
Madison, Connecticut, you're next. Thanks for waiting.
Hello?
You're on. Go ahead.
I'd like to say something. Howard Stern.
We're going to move on to Savannah, Georgia, on our line for Democrats. Good morning.
Hi, good morning. I find, the way email is being handled to be very, very troubling. It's my understanding that virtually every email is archived somewhere, okay? And any local, state, or federal government, okay, who thinks they have a reason to go into your background, do background checks, can get access to that either through a court order or, I mean, who knows with all the agencies we have today. I don't know what I'm likely to say tomorrow that could trigger a major investigation on my family. I mean, how do you protect yourself?
Well, there are different rules that apply depending on where you are when you send an email, of course. If you're in your home and you're using a private email company, you do have some protections under that law I mentioned earlier. The company can't routinely disclose your email, and if the government wants access to it, they're supposed to provide a warrant or a subpoena. Things get a little bit more complicated if you're working in a business because there the business does have an interest in the contents of the emails that are sent by its employees, or if you're employed by a public agency. If you're working for state government, for example, states have generally taken the view that those records are subject to open record laws and can be obtained by people who make requests. Sometimes privacy exemption is asserted in those claims, but the issue is still that that's essentially public record information.
Atlanta, Georgia, good morning.
Good morning. Hello.
Go ahead, sir. You're on the air with Mr. Rottenberg.
Well, thank you. My concern is that, first of all, I follow politics quite a bit, and to be frank with you, the Bush administration scares me because of all of the impingements about my private rights that they have instituted in the name of the global war on terrorism. I cannot wait until he gets out of office. What my question is that do you think that his administration has set any precedents so that future presidents will either follow his lead or they will admit that they were wrong and, give us back our rights?
Well, it's obviously a very important question that you're raising, both on the open government side and also on the privacy side. There have been a lot of concerns expressed about this administration, and it's interesting, in fact, that if you look at those two issues, on the open government side, there are very high levels of secrecy that the administration has asserted over the last few years, but on the privacy side, with the passage of the Patriot Act, the amount of privacy that individual citizens have has been reduced. So as the government is getting more secrecy, the public, unfortunately, is getting less privacy. And I go back to the history of this very important law, the Freedom of Information Act. It was passed in 1974 with the goal of promoting open government and reducing secrecy. At the same time, Congress also passed the Privacy Act, and the goal there was to protect the records of citizens that were held by the federal agencies. So from my perspective, the two key laws in this area, the open government law and the privacy law, are intended to do almost the opposite of what we've seen happen over the last few years. That is to say, to promote accountable open government while protecting the privacy of individual citizens.
Our last call for our guest comes from Levittown, Pennsylvania, on a line for Republicans. Good morning.
Hello.
You're on the air, sir.
Yes, I'm Bruce Moldovan from Levittown, Pennsylvania. And I have a question for you on as far as the emails go. I'm totally confused with emails. I'm signed on with AOL, and I certainly block certain programs from my children and everything, even though they're in their late teens, except for one. And the thing about emails is I've gotten a lot of messages across my email, for example, saying that they're like little warnings, and I'd be signing on to, for example, learn how to do resumes, and I'd Google resumes and everything, looking for a job, and it would come back and say, well, any information you pose can be sent to your employers and everything and used against you, and I don't want to complicate the situation, but I've also seen television shows. I'd be flipping around on television shows, and I'd see things like Dateline, where they'd arrest people who put emails out there that might need psychological help. You know what I'm saying? And they'd have decoys and I don't want to complicate the whole situation, but certain shows bothered me where they'd arrest certain individuals, and I don't know the whole scheme on it. Based on emails that they sent rather than the fact that maybe they need psychological help.
Thank you, caller. Running out of time.
Well, just briefly, I think part of what you're describing, of course, is that email is changing the way people communicate. It makes it easier to reach people quickly and inexpensively, but it's also creating traces of private activity, and sometimes those traces are useful in criminal investigations. Sometimes they become the material of congressional hearings, and I think over the next couple of weeks, in fact, that's what we're likely to see.
Mark Rotenberg, thank you very much for your time this morning. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's it for today's Washington Journal. On tomorrow's show, we will be talking with Perry Bacon of the Washington Post, Representative Nick Rahal, who was on a trip to the Middle East recently, and Nancy Youssef, the former Baghdad bureau chief for McClatchy Newspapers, as well as Thomas Littman, a Middle East adjunct scholar. Thank you for watching today, and have a good day.
Yes, hi. Am I through here?
Yep.
Hello?
I think so. You're on.
Okay, I'm on. Mr. Coburn, I'm having some difficulties here. You're obviously very intellectual, and it's kind of disturbing to find you're telegraphing how where your agenda really leaves you with that caller about a half hour ago who spoke about Israel, and you said something about your kind. I mean, that kind of telegraphs how you really feel. I mean, that's kind of an insulting remark. Your kind. What is your kind?
Your kind meant the kind, not, I think you're trying to insinuate that I meant Jewish or something. Your kind are the people who go out saying that any critic of Israel is an anti-Semite, who suddenly start linking your name with people who deny the Holocaust. There are people who do that. I think they do it for completely cynical reasons, mostly. And there may be some completely wrong-headed person who genuinely believes there's not a shred of evidence at all for it. And I get exercised about it. I think it's absolutely outrageous, slur, and so when I say your kind, that's what I'm talking about.
What do you say to that, Camden?
I beg your pardon?
Go ahead.
Yeah, my problem is that when someone is so one-sided against Israel, then there is some justice for people.
I'm not one-sided against Israel. In fact, the people I should say one thing. If you go to our website, you consistently read people who are not sitting in Petrolia, California, or in Oregon City, which is where Jeffrey Sinclair is from, or Camden, New Jersey, which is where you are, sir, from, but people who are in Israel. We publish Yuri Avneri pretty much every week. We publish Jonathan Cook pretty much every week. We publish Gideon Levy. We publish people who write for Haaretz. So what you're seeing on our website is people in Israel who are writing from there, both Jews and Palestinians who are writing from there. So when we say we're one-sided, we're not one-sided. We are presenting issues which don't make it into the American mainstream. There's a big difference.
Camden?
Making the point that it's in Israel where both Jews and Arabs have free voice. There are millions.
They don't have free voice. That's something else again.
Freedom.
They don't have free voice. You can read someone like Avneri, who is not an Arab, he's a Jew, will point out that inside Israel, and of course by 100 times more in the occupied territories, the voices aren't totally free. Actually, Avneri maybe would say in Israel itself that the Palestinians are more free. But Jonathan Cook, it's been shown time and again that it's not a perfect democracy. For one thing, most of the land can only be owned by Jews. That's not a perfect democracy at all. And it's getting worse, by the way, all the time, with extremists like Avigdor Lieberman proposing essentially that make it conditions almost impossible for Arabs inside Israel.
Camden, we'll wrap it up. Go ahead.
Please. It's interesting that you say Israel's not a perfect democracy. Therefore, what should we do? I mean, is it perfect?
Make it better. Make it better. Make it better.
Of course.
I believe the way it would be made better is actually by a secular, unified state. I don't actually think that the two nations theory is going to go very far.
It almost comes down to let's blame the Jews for everything.
No,
it is no
not true. I'm not going to accept that. You've got a sort of script kind of you're reading from. You're not listening to a word I'm saying.
No script,
I believe so. I believe so. You're going to say that we're constant critics of Israel.
I see. So this is how we shut down discussion, right?
No, it's not. I think the discussion, from my point of view, has been shut down almost as long as I've been in the United States. So when I have an opportunity here to say what the issues are, to say that you can have a constructive division of the future of the Middle East without being immediately accused, as the gentleman from Hobe Sound, Florida, did, of being in favor of the Holocaust. No, you didn't. I think you're saying that we're extremely anti-Israel. You haven't actually said, I don't know what your views are, whether you think Israel is doing well or what. I think basically the discussion of Israel in almost every site in America is crippled by ignorance and by prejudice. So that therefore, when people talk about, the roadmap to peace, the information that's available for people even to know is not there. because you cannot have a rational discussion about these issues in 99% of the U.S. press.
Following up on that, an emailer asks, what is your reaction to the Jimmy Carter book? Peace, Not Apartheid.
I think the Jimmy Carter book was very well taken. I think he did a fine job. It was amazing. I mean, to be honest with you, the word apartheid, which caused shock here, in Israel, South Africa, South African Jews years ago said, yes, in some ways apartheid is worse in the occupied territories in Israel than it was in South Africa, in some ways. I think it's tremendous that a former president should have actually put these things down. And I think it was very interesting that suddenly, when the lobby went after him, within seconds, a fairly well-respected former president was accused. I think, by the way, the critics overplayed their hand. Suddenly, Jimmy Carter was basically, an advocate of the concentration camps. Literally, that was said, because he actually, I think, intervened in some case with some judge. That, that he was in the pay of the Arabs. This, that, and the other thing. I mean, he was very careful. Actually, in a way, he gave a rather optimistic description of the situation in Israel proper, not in the occupied territories. But I think it's a sign that at least that book then, partly by the efforts of his critics, went to number 4 on, I think it went to number 4 on Amazon. It was really good. So it's a healthy sign.
We're going to take a short break, come back, take some more phone calls, and introduce our audience to your home, which is where?
My home is in Petrolia, Humboldt County, Northern California.
And where is that?
That is, if you look at the map of the United States, you go to California, you look at the bit that sticks out furthest into the Pacific Ocean, and you put your pencil point right on that tip, Cape Mendocino. That's pretty much where I live. It's about an hour and a half south of Eureka.
About as far away from Washington, D.C. as you can get? Is that
Well, you could
fair?
live in Hawaii, I guess, but then you're looking the other way. No, yeah, it's pretty far away from me.
And you write so much about public policy. Why do you live so far from?
I like the place. I can afford to live there. I love the country. In this day and age, you're on the internet. You can read you can read every paper in Washington, D.C. if you want to. You can read every paper in the world if you want to. I mean, it's true, I can't get on my bicycle and drive down if I wanted to and, I don't know, walk up to the Capitol and try and, talk to someone. But you can do everything you want now, and you can live in congenial surroundings and, among people you like, doing things you like, and that's the way it is. I can afford it, too.
We will be back in just a few moments with more calls for Alexander Cockburn.
I basically am a country guy. I lived 10 years in London. I grew up in Ireland. I lived 10 years in London. I lived 10 years in New York. I lived in Key West for a while. I lived various Central California, and I came up here. And people, the days when you'd said, rural seclusion, the remote writer, in his rural fastness, coming out wearing a sort of belted mujik shirt like Leo Tolstoy, it's not really where it's at. I mean, with modern communications, you can wake up in the morning and read every newspaper on the planet. It's very different. I mean, we have here in Petrolia, in the winter we have power outages and all the rest of it. But these days, personally, I don't particularly like living in cities. But but you've got a DSL line now. You've got every image in the world. Too many of them available to you. I can be in San Francisco in 5 hours. If I feel like, if I've got meetings and fly around. So that's where I'm at in what I do. And it's an ideal circumstance for me. I think I count myself pretty fortunate.
I like old iron. This is an old 62 Plymouth Belvedere wagon. I've driven that across the States a couple of times. It's got a 318 wide block in it. Sleep in the back if you want. Plenty of room to look under the hood. As long as you keep the engine tuned, I think it's actually less polluting not to have a catalytic converter. As my friend Pierre Spray instructed, all the catalytic converter does is create sulfuric acid, which it then sprays all over the neighborhood after the hydrocarbons pass over the catalytic converter. And then, this is a car from the late 60s. Newport, 68 Newport two-door with a 383 engine in it. Which actually I got here on the West Coast. Drive it around, try not to get tickets in it. But I like to just drive around, drive across the country, meet lots of people. Modern cars, all cars look the same these days. They've got no character at all. You could drive thousands of miles in America and barely see an old car anymore, tucked in behind the wheels of their Hondas or their Toyotas. Few holdouts still try and support the American auto industry. Just go along in your older car. It'll cost a little bit more in gas, maybe, but then you haven't spent all the money in the first place. So it works out pretty good. And you feel you're driving along with something with a little character in it. That's done by my friend, the artist Steve Rogers. Done in high relief about a terrible massacre, basically sponsored by the United States on the Rio Sumpul, on the borders of Honduras. There are the soldiers doing the massacre, and there are the poor people, the peasants carrying the coffin. There's a lot of work by Steve Rogers around here. He's one of my favorite artists. And here's the old stable, which I built about 5 years ago, or friends of mine in the valley built. And there's Agnes, 17 years old, who is a thoroughbred Arab cross. Wonderful, wonderful horse. My mother bred horses. So I've always liked horses, ride Agnes every day. And here she's having her mid-morning snack. Come on, Jasper, come in this way. This is a rammed earth building, which we call the cider house, which we put up about 3 or 4 years ago. Rammed earth is a very old technique of ramming earth down. I think, like many writers, actually, I like thinking about things other than writing. And I like to build. This is a square building going into a dome, done by my friend and neighbor, Greg Smith. This is a freeze. Jasper's very pleased, he's in the picture. The preparation of cider, which Steve Rogers did. I think many people thought this was some kind of outpost of Al-Qaeda at one point because it looked a little like a Middle Eastern mosque. But it's a nice, very nice building. I love to build. If I had enough money, I'd be like Ludwig II of Bavaria. I'd never stop building. I grew up in Ireland and there were plenty of towers around, usually Norman keeps in various stages of ruin. There was also the old round towers. There was one in my home village of Ardmore. So I've always been kind of tower oriented. So after being here a while in Petrolia, built a tower, sort of tower-like anyway, out of mostly recycled redwood. And people who donate to Counterpunch or support us, we put them up in the tower. And they stay, they're very happy up there, there's no one around. So the tower has stayed in my life. I could shut myself up in the tower, I suppose, and emerge after 15 years with a very important piece of writing, but I'm more social, so I stay 300 feet lower down and talk to the animals, and the animals talk to me. Your Miserable Life as a Dog. Want to give me the first chapter? There have been books about dogs, you know, written by dogs. My Dog Tulip, one of the nicest books about a dog ever written. And Jasper here is secretly writing his memoirs. He's going to disclose the life of dictating novels, canine exploitation. There he goes.
Destroying their own Constitution and Bill of Rights to push the people into serfdom and pretty much try to establish problem, solution, reactive type environment.
Thank you, caller. Anything there you want to respond to, Mr. Lippman?
No, I would just say briefly, I'm always amused when people of any persuasion talk about all the things that the media don't cover and that are covered up. How do they know about them?
Tom Lippman is with the Middle East Institute, which is?
Middle East Institute is what's commonly referred to as a think tank. The primary mission has long been education, language instruction, and informing people about the Middle East. We have speakers programs, instruction in Turkish, Farsi, Arabic, and Hebrew. And we have a cadre of people like me who have affiliations or expertise of one kind or another about the region, who make ourselves available for public dialogue and discourse.